welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this 13th Sunday after Pentecost, when our scripture reading is the 139th Psalm, verses 1 through 6 and 13 through 18. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. That I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God! How vast is the sum of them! I try to count them. They are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Because of the intricacy and complexity of this psalm and the way that we'll be studying it today, this Bible for Worship will run probably almost twice as long as most of them do. I believe that it's worth that additional time in order to follow the details of what we'll be talking about and to see what can be learned when we look with a little more resource, a little more technical precision, not things that are incomprehensible or over our heads, but things that take us a little farther into the details of Bible study and Bible translation than we normally go. I think we'll see that that investment is worth it, and I invite you to join me now on that journey. This 139th Psalm is a favorite of many, many people, and it's easy to see why. The imagery that it conveys of both God and the human, the cadences of the translation, the majestic feel of the entire thing with its scope of God's greatness and human life from its very beginnings to its very end. God's might is in play here. God's knowledge is vast. God's care is deep and meaningful. And human value and dignity and connection to God are so very much a part of what we feel when we hear this psalm. There's distance there between God's greatness and human life, and yet it's with awe and gratitude that that distance is noted. Now, these are all certainly themes that are worthy of Scripture, worthy of the Bible, of ancient Israel's reflection and of Christian reflection as well. These are themes that are worthy of our contemplation in our faith and of even shaping our faith. But these themes, read in this psalm, are actually shaped by two non-biblical factors, neither of which is part of the psalm, and when we understand them, we'll see the ways in which they change what the psalm is all about. The first of those factors is the kind of selective reading that we get every so often in the lectionary. Here we read verses 1 through 6 and 13 through 18 of the psalm, but what's going on in verses 7 through 12 and after verse 18 through verse 24 at the end of the psalm. That selective reading that is chosen for us by the people who build the lectionary, the system of readings, makes a real difference in what we hear. And the second factor that shapes how we hear this is the limited knowledge of the biblical world that any of us ever has at any particular time. In this case, because of the translation history of the Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, now the updated edition of that NRSV, all going back to the King James Version, new information about the world and the languages of biblical times shifts and really in some ways transforms what we can hear in this psalm. How does that make a difference? What difference does that make? Well, I'd like to suggest that while in many cases it doesn't actually change the fundamental dynamics that we're looking at in a piece of scripture, here in Psalm 139, it really can. In terms of the selective reading that we're doing, we will find, if we look at the very beginning and the very end of the psalm, and particularly at the end, after the part that we finish reading, that this psalm, which sounds so much like a majestic hymn to God's greatness and human dignity, actually turns out to be a prayer of innocence, a prayer to God saying, God, I've been wrongly accused. Please stand up for me. You know me. Stand up for me and save me from my accusers. In verse 19, we see, and that's the verse right after what we've read, you might want to look it up. We see that the psalmist turns to a plea for those who despise God, who go after idols, those who are evil people, to be destroyed. God, destroy them. What's that doing in a hymn to God's greatness? When we get to the end of the psalm, in verses 23 and 24, again, using some of that new language knowledge that we have, it sounds something like this. Examine me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my cares. Then see if an idol has held sway over me, and lead me into the eternal dominion. That's not what you're going to read in the New Revised Standard or its updated edition at the end of this psalm. I'm reading from the Anchor Bible volume by Professor Mitchell Dahoud, already over 50 years old. And Dahoud is one who uses, as an expert, this knowledge of ancient languages in order to deepen our approach to the psalm. I rely heavily on him in this entire Bible for worship. But when we hear at the end of the psalm this prayer, see if an idol has held sway over me, examine me, know my heart, test me, know my cares, and lead me into the eternal dominion, suddenly we can go back and read the beginning of the psalm differently, where it doesn't exactly say, you have searched me and known me, you know when I sit down, but rather, O Lord, examine me and know me yourself. The beginning of the plea with which the psalm also ends. The prayer to be vindicated of this charge that the psalmist has been chasing after idols. It makes a difference how we read it. Even in verse 18, at the end of our reading, we read in the NRSV updated edition, I come to the end, I am still with you. And it sounds like a great cry of confidence and reassurance when we read the psalm as a prayer. Dahoud would suggest, may I rise and my continuance be with you. It's another voicing of that prayer. I have been pressed down, oppressed, troubled, harassed by these people who accuse me. May I rise and my continuance be with you, O God. As it says in the last verse, bring me into the eternal dominion. That makes a difference, to know that this is a prayer and a plea, not just a hymn glorifying God's majesty. The second factor I mentioned is this matter of the ancient languages. There were tablets, clay tablets, dug out of an archaeological dig a century ago in a place called Ugarit. And the language that was discovered on those tablets had never been seen before, but it's a close relative of ancient biblical Hebrew. And Professor Dahoud, who wrote the Anchor Bible commentary on the Psalms, from which we're working, Professor Dahoud was an expert in the Ugaritic language, all the Northwest Semitic languages, as they're called. And by working with the texts from that other community, as well as looking more closely at the biblical text, he's able to make suggestions about other ways to read the language of the Bible. Now, partly that's important because in our oldest manuscripts, there are no vowels in the Hebrew text of the Bible. And so, to bring an analogy from English, BRD is all that would be written, whether you wanted to say, talk about bread, or a bird, or a board like you cut with a saw, or being bored like some people get in Bible studies. They're all BRD in their consonants, and without writing the vowels, you might not know which word is meant. Now, most of the time you do. Try it sometime. Look at an English language paragraph. Take out all the vowels. I bet you can still read most of it. But sometimes it gets really ambiguous, really confusing. And Dahoud suggests that because back in the 17th century, when the King James Version was being translated, and in the centuries before that, when commentaries were being written on the Psalms, since people then didn't know this other Northwest Semitic language so closely related to Hebrew, they didn't have all the resources they might in order to interpret the consonants of the biblical text. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, Dahoud applied that knowledge to this psalm and turned up something very, very interesting and significant. Because this psalm, he would suggest, has nothing to do with God knitting together the psalmist in the womb. Let's read it again, verse 13 from the New Revised Standard Updated Edition. It was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. That's the NRSV updated edition, verses 14 through the beginning of 16. And they're familiar lines to many people, imagining God carefully knitting together the human being in the womb. Dahoud, wondering what exactly that might have to do with the psalmist's plea to God in order to be vindicated from this charge of worshiping idols, takes a closer look at those lines in Hebrew. And this is his translation. I praise you, Most High, because you are awesome. I fall in adoration before you, so dreadful in your deeds. My soul itself you have known of old. My bones were never hidden from you, since I was nipped off in the secret place, kneaded in the depths of the netherworld. Your eyes beheld my life stages. Rather different. It's about a God who has known us from the beginning, not a God who put us together in the womb. It's about a person who is not intricately woven in the depths of the earth, but about a person being kneaded like clay. Think Genesis 2. God picks up dust of the earth and mixes it with water and molds it into the human form and breathes into it the breath of life. There it happens in the garden. Here it happens in the depths of the earth. But that image of humans being made in the depths of the earth, that recurs elsewhere in Scripture as well. There is no unformed substance in Dahoud's translation. He understands this as being that God knew us knew all of our life stages, not before they came to exist, but before any of them were seen. These differences are significant because in this, all of the imagery that has been brought into the argument by anti-abortion activists quoting the Bible simply disappears from Psalm 139. The emphasis here is on God's protection and God's vindication. You've known me from the beginning, God. You know who I am. So judge me, please, because I trust your knowledge of me. This is the basis of the psalmist's prayer to save. And it's not about who knit me together in the womb, but it is about the thoroughness with which God knows us inside and out, beginning to end. And therefore the psalmist can with confidence say, examine me, O Lord, you know I don't worship idols. This does not resolve anybody's questions about abortion. I don't imagine that it would, and I'm not trying to. It really doesn't matter at this point what any of us think about abortion when we deal with Psalm 139. And whatever we do think about abortion, however we relate to that issue as a moral issue, as a religious issue, as a spiritual issue, and we all have to wrestle with that to live in our contemporary world. But whatever we might think of that, first of all, we can respect people's opinions and feelings and values simply because they are those of another human being who deserves our respect. That's part of what's in this psalm, the dignity of the human being. But equally important, any of us who care about building our theology and our ethical positions and our lives in the world around a careful, well-informed, closely examined reading and contemplation of Scripture, any of us in that case will recognize that Psalm 139 has no particular place in a discussion about the very important issue of abortion. It does have a place in any discussion about how well God knows us, inside and out, heart, soul, and mind, and how much we can count on God's knowledge guiding God's judgment and grace. God bless.